I never thought a wedding reception would teach me the most profound lesson about human kindness, resilience, and the transformative power of understanding. But there I was, standing in the middle of the Riverside Country Club ballroom, watching my 7-year-old son Michael melt down in front of 200 strangers, feeling like the world's most inadequate mother while simultaneously discovering something extraordinary about the human capacity for compassion. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story isn't just about one moment of crisis and rescue. It's about the journey that led us there, the patterns of struggle and misunderstanding that had shaped our lives, and the unexpected ways that grace can enter our world when we least expect it. Michael has autism. High functioning, they call it, though I've never been fond of that term. It suggests there's something wrong with him that needs fixing, when really, he just experiences the world differently. More intensely, more completely. Where others see chaos, he sees overwhelming sensory input that his nervous system can't filter. Where others hear celebratory music, he hears an assault on his ears. Where others find comfort in crowds, he finds suffocation. The diagnosis came when he was 4, after months of evaluations and specialists and well-meaning relatives suggesting that maybe he just needed more discipline, more structure, more of whatever magic ingredient they believed would transform my sensitive, brilliant, overwhelmed little boy into the neurotypical child they thought he should be. I remember the day Dr. Martinez delivered the diagnosis. Michael was playing in the corner of her office, methodically arranging wooden blocks into perfect geometric patterns while she explained terms like sensory processing disorder and executive functioning challenges. I felt simultaneously relieved to finally have answers and terrified of what those answers might mean for his future. He's incredibly intelligent, Dr. Martinez had said, watching Michael construct an elaborate tower with mathematical precision. But he's going to need support navigating a world that wasn't designed for minds like his. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of learning to decode his needs, of advocating for accommodations, of developing strategies for managing the overwhelming sensory input that could send him into meltdown mode without warning. 3 years of watching other parents effortlessly navigate social situations that felt like obstacle courses for us. And 3 years of feeling increasingly isolated from the world of typical family experiences. My cousin Sarah's wedding was supposed to be different. Sarah and I grew up together, practically sisters, spending summers at our grandmother's house in Vermont, building fort structures that rivaled Michael's block towers and dreaming about our future weddings. When she got engaged to David, she'd specifically asked me to bring Michael to the ceremony. "He's family," she'd said when I hesitantly mentioned that large events could be challenging for him. "I want him there." Besides, kids make weddings more fun. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have known better. But there's this part of me that always hopes, always believes that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time Michael will adapt. Maybe this time the world will feel a little less overwhelming to him. Maybe this time we'll have one of those normal family experiences that other people seem to take for granted. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with preparation. Not just the usual preparation of buying appropriate clothes and arranging childcare for the evening, but the intensive preparation that comes with taking a child with autism to a major social event. We practiced walking into loud rooms. We role-played meeting new people. We developed exit strategies and coping mechanisms and contingency plans for every scenario I could imagine. Michael approached it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. He made lists of potential sensory triggers. He packed a bag with his favorite fidget toys and noise-canceling headphones. He asked detailed questions about the venue, the music, the food, the timeline of events. He wanted to understand every variable he could control, because understanding meant predictability, and predictability meant safety. The night before the wedding, as I tucked him into bed, he looked at me with those serious eyes that held so much intelligence and sensitivity. "Mama," he said, What if I get overwhelmed tomorrow? It was a question that cut straight to the heart of every parent's fear. Not just parents of children with autism, but every parent who has ever worried about their child's ability to navigate the world. What if he gets overwhelmed? What if he can't cope? What if I can't help him? What if we don't belong? We'll handle it together, I told him, words I'd repeated countless times over the years. We always do. But even as I said it, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. Because the truth was, I didn't always know how to handle it. There had been plenty of times when my strategies failed, when his overwhelm exceeded my ability to help, when we'd had to leave events early or avoid them altogether. There had been too many times when I'd felt like a failure as a mother, unable to provide him with the simple, normal experiences that other children took for granted. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, one of those perfect October days when the autumn leaves seem to glow with inner light. Sarah had chosen the season deliberately, knowing that the natural beauty of New England in fall would provide a stunning backdrop for her celebration. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock, followed by cocktails and dinner at the country club. Michael woke up early, as he always did, and went through his morning routine with characteristic precision. Breakfast at exactly 7:30. Shower with water temperature tested to ensure it was neither too hot nor too cold. Clothes laid out the night before and put on in the same order every day. These routines weren't quirks or preferences. They were necessary structure in a world that often felt unpredictable and overwhelming. As we drove to the church, I found myself watching him in the rearview mirror. He was wearing his navy blue suit, the one we'd picked out together specifically for special occasions. His hair was combed neatly, and he clutched his small bag of comfort items with the same intensity other children might reserve for a beloved stuffed animal. "Tell me about the plan again," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he was already beginning to feel anxious. We'd been over the plan dozens of times, but repetition was part of how he managed anxiety. The more he could predict and prepare for, the more likely he was to successfully navigate challenging situations. "We'll arrive at the church and find our seats," I recited. "The ceremony will last about 30 minutes. Then we'll drive to the country club for the reception. If you need a break, we can step outside. If you need to leave early, we'll leave early. The most important thing is that you feel safe and comfortable." He nodded, but I could see him processing the information, running through potential scenarios in his mind. This was how his brain worked, always anticipating, always preparing, always trying to create order from chaos. The ceremony itself went better than I had dared to hope. The church was large enough that the sound didn't feel overwhelming, and Michael found comfort in the predictable structure of the service. He sat quietly beside me, occasionally taking out a small fidget toy to keep his hands busy, but generally managing the sensory input without difficulty. Sarah looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, her dress flowing behind her like something from a fairy tale. David's face lit up when he saw her, and I felt tears prick my eyes at the pure joy of the moment. This was what we'd come for, this celebration of love and commitment and family. Michael watched the ceremony with the same intense focus he brought to everything that captured his interest. He was fascinated by the ritual aspects, the predictable sequence of events, the formal language of the vows. When the couple exchanged rings, he whispered to me, "Why do they give each other circles?" "Because circles don't have beginnings or endings," I whispered back, "like their love." He considered this for a moment, then nodded with satisfaction. The explanation fit his logical worldview, and I could see him filing it away as another piece of information about how human relationships worked. The problem started when we arrived at the country club for the reception. The Riverside Country Club is one of those grand old establishments that prides itself on elegance and tradition. Built in the 1920s, it has the kind of old-world charm that makes it a popular venue for weddings and other celebrations. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across cream-colored walls, and the hardwood floors gleamed under the ambient lighting. Oil paintings of pastoral scenes hung in gilt frames, and tall windows overlooked meticulously maintained gardens. For most people, it would have been beautiful. For Michael, it was sensory hell. The problem started before we even entered the main ballroom. The foyer was filled with guests arriving for the cocktail hour, their voices echoing off the high ceilings and marble floors. The sound bounced and amplified, creating layers of noise that seemed to press against us from every direction. A string quartet played in one corner, their music mixing with the conversations and laughter to create a wall of sound that made my own head spin. I felt Michael tense beside me the moment we walked through the doors. His hand tightened in mine, and I could see that telltale look beginning to form in his eyes. That glazed, slightly panicked expression that meant he was already working at maximum capacity just to process the sensory input around him. "It's okay, buddy," I whispered, guiding him toward what looked like a quieter corner near the windows. "We'll find a place to settle in." But quiet corners don't exist at wedding receptions. The cocktail hour was designed to be social, to encourage mingling and conversation. Everywhere we turned, there were people. Aunts and uncles I hadn't seen in years, college friends of Sarah's, coworkers and neighbors and family friends. All of them talking and laughing and existing in that effortless social way that had always seemed like a foreign language to my son. The photographer moved through the crowd like a dancer, capturing candid moments with rapid-fire efficiency. Each flash of his camera made Michael flinch, and I realized with growing concern that we were in trouble. The combination of noise, lights, crowds, and unpredictable movement was creating the perfect storm for sensory overload. I found a spot near the back wall, away from the main cluster of guests, and knelt down to Michael's level. He was starting to stim, his hands flapping slightly at his sides in the repetitive motion that helped him regulate his nervous system. To most people, it would have looked like unusual behavior. To me, it was a warning sign that he was approaching his limit. "Remember what we practiced?" I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "Deep breaths, count to 10. He nodded, but I could see the anxiety building in his eyes. The flapping intensified, and I gently guided his hands to his lap, helping him redirect the motion into something less visible. It wasn't that I was ashamed of his stimming, but I knew that drawing attention to us would only make things worse. 1, 2, 3, I counted with him, modeling the breathing technique his occupational therapist had taught us. 4, 5, 6. For a moment, it seemed to work. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he managed to focus on my face instead of the chaos around us. But then someone dropped a glass somewhere across the room, and the sound of shattering crystal cut through the ambient noise like a gunshot. Michael's hands flew to his ears, and he let out a small whimper. The sound was barely audible over the crowd noise, but I heard it clearly. It was the sound of a child reaching his breaking point. "I know, sweetheart. I know it's loud. We can step outside if you need to." I started to stand, planning to guide him toward the exit, but before we could move, the situation deteriorated rapidly. A burst of laughter from a nearby group made him flinch again, and then the DJ began testing his equipment for the reception. The speakers crackled with feedback, a harsh, electronic screech that made several guests wince. For Michael, it was the final straw. His whimper became a cry. Then the cry became a wail. Then the wail became a full-throated scream that cut through the music and conversation like a knife through silk. I've been in this situation before, too many times to count. But it never gets easier. Every head in the room turned toward us, and I could feel the weight of their stares like physical pressure. Some faces showed genuine concern, others confusion. A few showed barely concealed annoyance, as if my child's distress was a personal affront to their good time. The thing about autism meltdowns is that they're not tantrums. They're not behavioral choices or attempts to manipulate or control. They're neurological responses to overwhelming stimuli, as involuntary as a sneeze or a hiccup. When Michael's nervous system became overloaded, his brain essentially short-circuited, leaving him unable to process information or regulate his emotions. Understanding this intellectually didn't make it any less heartbreaking to watch. "Shit, Michael, it's okay," I said, reaching for him. But he was beyond comfort now. He dropped to the floor, curling into a ball with his hands pressed firmly over his ears, his body shaking with the effort of trying to block out the overwhelming sensory input. The music kept playing. The conversations gradually resumed. But there was an undercurrent of tension now, a sense that we were disrupting something sacred. I could hear whispered comments floating over the noise, fragments of conversation that felt like shards of glass in my heart. Can't she control him? Why would she bring him if he's going to act like that? Poor Sarah, on her wedding day. Maybe they should step outside. Is he sick? Some kids just need more discipline. Each comment felt like a small dagger to my heart, not because they were particularly cruel, but because they revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. These were good people, mostly. Family and friends who loved Sarah and wanted her day to be perfect. But they didn't understand that Michael wasn't throwing a tantrum or being defiant or attention-seeking. He was having a neurological response to overwhelming stimuli, and he literally could not control it, any more than someone having a seizure could control their convulsions. I knelt on the floor beside him, ignoring the stares and whispers and the way conversation seemed to halt as people walked past us. The elegant ballroom, with its crystal chandeliers and gleaming floors, felt like a stage where we were unwillingly performing the role of the disruptive family, the ones who didn't quite fit in. "I'm here, baby. Mama's here. We're going to get through this together." But he was too far gone. His screaming had reached that pitch that only a child in true distress can achieve, and I could feel panic rising in my own chest. We needed to leave. We needed to get out of there before this got worse, before the stares turned to outright hostility, before someone approached us with polite but firm suggestions that we take our disruption elsewhere. I was calculating the logistics of carrying a 7-year-old in the middle of a meltdown across a crowded room when I saw her approaching. She was young, maybe early 20s, with shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore the black and white uniform of the catering staff with a small name tag that read, Emma. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and she moved with deliberate slowness, as if she understood that sudden movements might make things worse. While everyone else in the room was either staring at us or pointedly looking away, pretending that our crisis wasn't happening, Emma was focused entirely on Michael. She approached us with the same careful attention a wildlife photographer might use when approaching a frightened animal, understanding that the wrong move could escalate the situation. She didn't say anything at first. She just crouched down on the floor beside us, several feet away from Michael but close enough that he could see her in his peripheral vision. The fact that she was willing to get down on the floor, to literally meet him at his level, spoke volumes about her understanding of the situation. And then she started humming. It wasn't a song I recognized. It wasn't really a song at all. It was more like a rhythm, a gentle, repetitive pattern of sound that seemed to cut through the chaos of the reception. The humming was soft enough that it didn't add to the sensory overload, but distinctive enough that Michael's sobbing began to quiet as he tried to identify the source. I watched in amazement as my son's breathing began to slow. His hands remained over his ears, but his body started to relax slightly. The humming continued, steady and soothing, like a musical heartbeat that provided a point of focus in the overwhelming chaos around us. Emma reached slowly into her apron pocket and pulled out a straw wrapper. With careful, deliberate movements, she began to twist it into a shape. Her fingers worked methodically, creating something small and intricate while she continued to hum. The motion was hypnotic, purposeful, and I could see Michael's eyes beginning to track her movements. This was masterful in its simplicity. She was giving him something to focus on, something predictable and contained, while simultaneously providing auditory input that was soothing rather than overwhelming. She was creating a pocket of calm in the middle of chaos, a small island of understanding in a sea of confusion. Michael's eyes were fixed on her hands now, watching the transformation with the kind of intense focus that meant he was beginning to regulate himself. The screaming had stopped, replaced by quiet sniffling. His body was still curled in a protective ball, but the rigid tension was beginning to ease. When Emma finished her creation, she held out a tiny paper heart. It was simple, imperfect, but somehow beautiful in its simplicity. The paper was white with small blue stripes, and the heart was no bigger than a quarter. She placed it on the floor between them, close enough for Michael to reach if he wanted to, but far enough away that he didn't feel pressured or crowded. Michael looked at the heart. Then he looked at Emma. Then, slowly, carefully, he reached out and picked it up. He smiled. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. Not the forced, polite smile he'd learned to use in social situations, but the real, unguarded expression of joy that meant he felt safe and understood. It was the smile that reminded me why I fought so hard for him every day, why I advocated and educated and refused to accept that he needed to change to fit into the world. Emma smiled back, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the room had disappeared. The music was still playing. The conversations were still happening, but for Michael, the world had suddenly become manageable again. He sat up, still holding the paper heart, and his breathing returned to normal. "Thank you," I whispered to Emma, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how you knew ... She looked at me with those kind eyes, and I saw something there I recognized. Understanding. Experience. The look of someone who had been where I was, who had seen what I was seeing, who knew the difference between a tantrum and a meltdown, between defiance and distress. "My brother's like him," she said simply. "I know the signs." Those 6 words contained volumes. They told me that she understood that Michael's meltdown wasn't a behavioral choice but a neurological necessity. They told me that she knew the difference between a child acting out and a child whose nervous system had become overwhelmed. They told me that she had probably been in my position before, watching someone she loved struggle with a world that wasn't designed for their needs. Most importantly, they told me that she saw Michael not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be understood. "How old is your brother?" I asked, my curiosity overcoming my usual reserve. 15 now, Emma replied, her voice carrying the same protective love I heard in my own voice when I talked about Michael. "He's nonverbal, but he's incredible. He builds these amazing structures with blocks and LEGOs. Perfect geometric patterns that look like they came from an architecture textbook. He sees mathematical relationships that most people can't even imagine." I could hear the pride in her voice, the fierce love that came from understanding someone deeply. It was the same tone I used when I talked about Michael's ability to remember complex patterns, his talent for organizing information, his unique perspective on the world. "It's not easy," I said, and she nodded. "No, it's not, but it's worth it. People just need to take the time to understand." As we talked, I watched Michael exploring his paper heart with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. He was examining the folds, testing the strength of the paper, understanding how the simple transformation had been accomplished. The heart had become his anchor, his reminder that someone in this overwhelming place understood him. Emma stood up slowly, giving Michael one more gentle smile before she returned to her duties. But the effect of her intervention lasted for the rest of the evening. Michael kept the paper heart clutched in his hand, and whenever the noise level rose or the lights seemed too bright, he would look at it and take a deep breath. It had become his talisman, his proof that understanding was possible even in the most overwhelming circumstances. We stayed for another hour and a half. Not because Michael was suddenly comfortable with the sensory environment, but because he had found a way to cope with it. He spent most of the time sitting quietly beside me, occasionally showing other children his paper heart and explaining in his precise, formal way how it had been made. A few adults tried to engage him in conversation, and while he remained largely quiet, he seemed less anxious than usual. One of Sarah's college friends, a teacher named Maria, seemed particularly interested in hearing about his paper heart. She listened carefully as he explained the folding process, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was genuinely interested in his perspective. "You know," she said to me quietly while Michael was showing the heart to her daughter, "I have a student who would love to learn how to make these. Would it be okay if I asked Emma to show me?" It was a small thing, but it felt significant. Here was someone who saw value in what had helped Michael, who understood that his coping mechanism might be useful for other children. It was recognition that his needs weren't abnormal or wrong, just different. I watched him throughout the evening, marveling at the transformation. It wasn't that Emma had fixed anything about Michael or about the situation. The music was still loud, the lights were still bright, the crowd was still overwhelming. But she had given him something more valuable than a solution. She had given him recognition. She had seen him in his moment of greatest distress and had responded not with judgment or frustration, but with understanding and acceptance. As the evening wound down, I found myself thinking about all the times I had wished for exactly this kind of intervention. All the times I had watched Michael struggle in social situations and prayed for someone, anyone, to see past the behavior to the person underneath. All the times I had felt isolated and judged as a parent, carrying the weight of other people's assumptions about my child and my parenting. The grocery store meltdowns when the fluorescent lights became too much. The playground incidents when other children didn't understand his need for routine. The birthday parties we'd had to leave early when the sensory input became overwhelming. The family gatherings where relatives offered unsolicited advice about discipline and structure, as if autism was something that could be corrected with the right approach. It's not that I expected the world to change for Michael. I had long ago accepted that accommodations would be rare and understanding would be limited. But Emma had shown me that sometimes individual acts of kindness can create pockets of safety in an otherwise overwhelming world. She had reminded me that there are people who understand, who see beyond the surface behavior to the genuine need underneath. When it was time to leave, I made sure to find Emma again. She was clearing tables in the back of the room, moving with the same deliberate care she had shown when approaching Michael. The reception was winding down, and most of the guests had moved to the bar or the dance floor. "I wanted to thank you again," I said. "What you did for my son tonight, it meant everything." She paused in her work and looked at me with those same kind eyes. "How is he doing?" I glanced over at Michael, who was sitting quietly at our table, still holding his paper heart while he watched the last few couples dancing. "Better. So much better. That little heart you made him, it's like it gave him a piece of calm to hold on to." Emma smiled. "My brother does the same thing. When he gets overwhelmed, he needs something small and familiar to focus on. Usually it's a smooth stone or a piece of fabric. Something with a good texture. Where did you learn to do that? To respond that way?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Trial and error, mostly. Years of watching my brother struggle and trying to figure out what helped. My parents were great, but they didn't always know what to do either. So I started paying attention to what worked and what didn't." "How long have you been working here?" "About 2 years. It's just part-time while I'm in school. I'm studying special education." She gestured toward Michael. "I want to work with kids like him, kids like my brother." I think there's so much potential that people don't see because they're focused on the behaviors instead of the person underneath. I felt tears prick my eyes. Here was someone who not only understood, but who was dedicating her life to helping other children like Michael. He's lucky to have you for a sister. I'm lucky to have him for a brother, she corrected gently. He's taught me more about patience and creativity and seeing the world differently than any textbook ever could. As we said goodbye and gathered our things, I realized that Emma had given me more than just a solution to Michael's immediate distress. She had given me hope. Hope that there are people in the world who understand difference without judgment, who respond to need with compassion, who see the humanity in every person regardless of how they communicate or behave. More than that, she had given me a glimpse of what the future might hold. She was studying to become a special education teacher, which meant that someday, children like Michael would have her in their corner. They would have someone who understood their needs not as problems to be solved, but as differences to be accommodated. The drive home was quiet. Michael fell asleep in the back seat, still clutching his paper heart, and I found myself thinking about the evening's events. I thought about the other guests at the wedding, many of whom had seemed uncomfortable or annoyed by Michael's meltdown. I thought about the looks and whispers, the assumptions and judgments. But mostly, I thought about Emma. She hadn't been trained in autism intervention, at least not yet. She hadn't studied childhood development or sensory processing disorders in any formal way. She simply had experience with someone she loved, and she had allowed that experience to guide her response to another person in need. She had seen Michael as a human being first, a person with autism second, and a problem not at all. It occurred to me that this was what true inclusion looked like. Not special accommodations or formal programs, though those certainly have their place, but simple human recognition. The ability to see past surface behavior to underlying need. The willingness to respond with compassion rather than judgment. Over the weeks that followed, I found myself returning to that moment again and again. Whenever I felt discouraged by the world's seeming inability to understand or accept Michael's differences, I would remember Emma with her gentle humming and her paper heart. I would remember that there are people who get it, who see beyond the behavior to the person underneath. Michael kept the paper heart for months. It became worn and faded, but he wouldn't let me throw it away. He would show it to new people he met, telling them about the nice lady who made it for him when he was scared. It became his way of explaining that there are people in the world who understand, who respond to fear and overwhelm with kindness rather than judgment. Eventually, the paper heart fell apart, as paper things do, but the lesson it taught us remains. That sometimes, in the midst of overwhelming circumstances, a single act of understanding can change everything. That recognition and acceptance are more powerful than any intervention or accommodation. That the world is full of people who, given the chance, will choose compassion over judgment. But the story doesn't end there. Because Emma's intervention that night started a chain of events that would change our lives in ways I never could have imagined. About a month after the wedding, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from the principal of Michael's school, Dr. Peterson, and my heart immediately jumped to my throat. Calls from the principal usually meant that something had gone wrong, that Michael had struggled with something and needed to be picked up early. "Mrs. Anderson," Dr. Peterson said, "I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I wanted to talk to you about Michael's progress this year. I braced myself for bad news." "Is everything okay?" "Actually, everything is more than okay. Michael has been having an exceptional year, and we think we've identified why." I was confused. While Michael had been doing well academically, social situations at school remained challenging. "I'm not sure I understand." "We have a new student teacher in Michael's classroom this semester. Her name is Emma Thompson, and she's working toward her degree in special education. The difference in Michael's behavior and engagement since she started has been remarkable." Emma Thompson. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. She seems to have a natural understanding of how to work with children on the autism spectrum, Dr. Peterson continued. Michael has been more participatory in class activities, more comfortable with transitions, and he's even started initiating social interactions with other students. And then it hit me. Emma Thompson. Emma from the wedding. Dr. Peterson, I said slowly, can you describe this student teacher? Certainly. She's a young woman, early 20s, with brown hair and glasses. Very thoughtful and patient. She has a brother with autism, which I think gives her unique insight into working with our students. It was her. The waitress who had helped Michael at the wedding was now his student teacher. Of all the schools in the district, of all the classrooms she could have been assigned to, she had ended up in his. I know her, I said, my voice filled with amazement. She helped Michael at a wedding reception a few weeks ago. She was working as a waitress, and when he had a meltdown, she knew exactly what to do. That explains so much, Dr. Peterson said. Michael talks about her constantly. He calls her Miss Emma who understands. Would you be available to meet with her and Michael's regular teacher next week? We'd like to discuss some strategies she's been using that might be helpful for his long-term educational plan. I agreed immediately, my mind racing with the implications. Emma wasn't just a kind stranger who had helped us through a difficult moment. She was going to be a professional educator, someone who would spend her career helping children like Michael navigate the world. The meeting the following week was eye-opening. Emma had developed a comprehensive understanding of Michael's needs and had implemented subtle but effective accommodations in the classroom. She had created a quiet corner where he could retreat when overwhelmed. She had established visual schedules that helped him navigate transitions. She had even taught other students in the class how to make paper hearts, turning what had been his personal coping mechanism into a classroom activity that everyone could enjoy. Michael has such unique strengths, Emma told me during our conversation. He sees patterns and connections that other kids miss. When we were studying symmetry in math, he was able to explain concepts that even some of the adults in the room hadn't considered. It's not always easy for him socially, I said. No, it's not. But I've noticed that when he's given the right support and environment, he's incredibly capable of connecting with others. He just needs people to understand his communication style. As we talked, I watched Michael interacting with Emma. There was an ease between them that I rarely saw him display with adults outside our family. She spoke to him directly, without the patronizing tone that some people used with children they perceived as different. She listened to his responses with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that showed she valued his perspective. Miss Emma, Michael said during a lull in our conversation, can you show my mom how to make the paper hearts? Emma smiled. Of course. Would you like to help me teach her? For the next few minutes, I watched my son and his teacher work together to show me the simple folding technique that had become so significant in our lives. Michael's explanations were detailed and precise, while Emma provided gentle encouragement and clarification. It was clear that they had developed a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. As the semester progressed, the changes in Michael became more and more apparent. He started talking about school with enthusiasm instead of anxiety. He began to develop friendships with other students, facilitated by Emma's understanding of how to create inclusive social opportunities. His meltdowns became less frequent, and when they did occur, he had developed better coping strategies. But perhaps most importantly, he began to see himself differently. Instead of viewing his autism as something that made him different or wrong, he started to understand it as a different way of experiencing the world. Emma had helped him recognize his strengths while also teaching him strategies for managing his challenges. The transformation wasn't just in Michael, either. Emma's presence in the classroom had created a culture of acceptance and understanding that benefited all the students. Children who had previously been excluded or marginalized found their voices. Students learned to appreciate different perspectives and communication styles. The entire learning environment became more inclusive and supportive. Near the end of the semester, Emma asked if she could meet with me privately. We sat in the school's conference room, the same room where I had attended countless meetings about Michael's needs over the years. "I wanted to thank you," she said, which surprised me. "Thank me? For what?" "For letting me work with Michael. For trusting me with his education. He's taught me so much about what it means to be a good teacher." I shook my head. "You're the one who's made all the difference. The night at the wedding and now here at school, ... You've changed his life." "Actually, I think he's changed mine," Emma said quietly. "Working with him has confirmed that this is exactly what I'm meant to do. I'm applying for a full-time position in special education next year, and I'm hoping to develop a program that focuses on strength-based approaches to autism education." "What does that mean?" "Instead of focusing on what children with autism can't do or trying to make them more normal, the approach focuses on their unique strengths and interests. It's about creating environments where they can thrive as they are, while also learning the skills they need to navigate the world." It was a revolutionary concept, at least in my experience. Most of the interventions Michael had received over the years had focused on changing his behaviors, making him more like neurotypical children. Emma was talking about something entirely different, accepting him as he was while giving him tools to succeed. "I'd love to have Michael be part of the program," Emma continued. "If you're interested, of course. I think he could be a wonderful advocate for other children with autism." The idea of Michael as an advocate was something I had never considered. But as I thought about it, I realized that Emma was right. His experiences, his unique perspective, his growing confidence in his own abilities, all of these could be valuable in helping other children and families navigate similar challenges. "I think he'd love that," I said. "He's always been eager to help others once he understands what they need," Emma smiled. "That's exactly what I thought. He has such a clear way of explaining things, and other kids respond to him because he understands what they're going through." As Emma's student teaching semester came to an end, I found myself dreading the transition. Michael had thrived under her guidance, and I worried about how he would adjust to losing that support. But Emma had anticipated this concern. "I've been working with Mrs. Richardson, Michael's regular teacher, to make sure the strategies we've developed can continue," she explained. "And I'll be staying at the school next year, so I'll still be available if he needs support." The transition was smoother than I had expected. Mrs. Richardson, who had initially seemed overwhelmed by Michael's needs, had learned from Emma's approach and was now implementing many of the same strategies. The quiet corner remained. The visual schedules continued, and the culture of acceptance that Emma had fostered persisted. But more than that, Michael had internalized many of the coping strategies Emma had taught him. He had developed a vocabulary for his needs, a toolkit for managing overwhelming situations, and most importantly, a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on conforming to neurotypical expectations. The summer after Emma's student teaching ended, we received an invitation that would mark another significant milestone in our journey. Emma had been hired as a special education teacher at a neighboring school district, and she was hosting a training workshop for parents and educators about strength-based approaches to autism education. Michael had been invited to be part of a panel discussion about the student perspective. The workshop was held at the local community center, and as we walked into the building, I was struck by how different this felt from that day at the wedding reception. Instead of dreading the crowd and the potential for overwhelm, Michael seemed excited about the opportunity to share his experiences. "Remember," he said to me as we found our seats, "I'm going to tell them about the paper heart technique. Miss Emma says it might help other kids." The transformation in his confidence was remarkable. Where once he had been a child who struggled to navigate social situations, He was now someone who saw himself as having valuable insights to share. Emma had helped him reframe his experiences not as deficits to overcome, but as perspectives that could benefit others. When it was time for the panel discussion, Michael took his place at the table with remarkable composure. He was joined by two other students with autism, a high school student named Alex, who was nonverbal but communicated through a tablet, and a middle school student named Sarah, who had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Emma moderated the discussion, asking thoughtful questions that allowed each student to share their experiences in their own way. When she asked Michael about strategies that had helped him in school, he launched into a detailed explanation of the paper heart technique, demonstrating the folding process for the audience. "When I get overwhelmed," he said, his voice clear and confident, "I make one of these hearts and it helps me focus on something calm and small instead of all the big loud things around me." Miss Emma taught me that it's okay to need these kinds of tools. They don't make me broken or wrong. They just help me be successful. The audience was captivated. Parents who had been struggling with their children's behaviors, teachers who had been frustrated by students they couldn't reach, therapists who had been searching for new approaches, all of them were hearing directly from the children they were trying to help. "What do you want adults to know about autism?" Emma asked. Michael thought for a moment before answering. "I want them to know that my brain works differently, not wrong. When I do things that seem weird, it's usually because I'm trying to help myself feel better or understand something better. And when I'm having a hard time, I'm not trying to be bad or difficult. I'm just trying to figure out how to handle something that feels too big for me." The simplicity and clarity of his explanation brought tears to many eyes in the audience. Here was a child who had learned to articulate his experiences in a way that was both accessible and profound. He had become, as Emma had predicted, a powerful advocate for understanding and acceptance. After the workshop, several parents approached us to thank Michael for his insights. One mother, whose son had been recently diagnosed, told him that his explanation had helped her understand her child's behavior in a completely new way. "My son does the same thing with his hands that you do," she said. "I've been trying to make him stop, but now I understand that he's trying to help himself feel better." Michael nodded seriously. "Stimming helps me think. Maybe it helps your son too." As we drove home from the workshop, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with a moment of crisis at a wedding reception, a child overwhelmed by sensory input and a mother feeling helpless to help him. But that moment had led to an encounter with Emma, which had led to transformative educational experiences, which had led to Michael developing the confidence and skills to help other children and families. It was a reminder that sometimes the most difficult moments can become the foundation for the most meaningful growth. That crisis and opportunity are often intertwined in ways we can't see until we're looking back. Over the years that followed, Michael's role as an advocate continued to expand. He participated in training sessions for teachers and therapists. He spoke at conferences about autism education. He mentored younger children who were struggling with their own diagnoses. But perhaps most importantly, he developed friendships with other children who appreciated his unique perspective. He learned that being different wasn't a barrier to connection, but could actually be a bridge to deeper understanding. Emma and I stayed in touch, and I watched her career flourish as she developed innovative programs that helped children with autism thrive in educational settings. Her approach, which focused on strengths rather than deficits, began to influence other educators and became a model for inclusive education practices. The paper heart technique that had started as a moment of crisis intervention became a widely used tool in special education classrooms. Emma published articles about it in professional journals, always crediting her brother and Michael as the inspiration for the approach. But for me, the most meaningful outcome of our journey was watching Michael grow into a confident, capable young man who understood his worth not despite his autism, but because of the unique perspective it gave him. He learned to see his differences as gifts rather than limitations, his challenges as opportunities for growth rather than barriers to overcome. As I write this story, Michael is now 15 years old. He's in high school, taking advanced mathematics and science courses, and he's involved in a robotics club where his attention to detail and pattern recognition skills are highly valued. He still uses coping strategies when environments become overwhelming, but he does so with confidence and self-advocacy skills that serve him well. He still keeps paper hearts in his backpack, not because he needs them as frequently as he once did, but because he likes to have them available to share with other students who might be struggling. He has become the kind of person who notices when others are overwhelmed and offers support in the same gentle, understanding way that Emma once offered to him. The wedding reception where our story began was 5 years ago, but the lessons from that evening continue to shape our lives. The waitress who understood didn't just help us through a difficult moment. She showed us a different way of seeing autism, a different way of approaching challenges, a different way of building connections with others. Emma taught us that understanding doesn't require extensive training or professional expertise. It requires empathy, patience, and the willingness to see beyond surface behavior to underlying need. It requires recognizing that different doesn't mean deficient. That challenge doesn't mean limitation. That crisis can become opportunity. Most importantly, she taught us that the world is full of people who, given the chance, will choose compassion over judgment, understanding over assumption, love over fear. Sometimes they appear as waitresses at wedding receptions. Sometimes they become teachers who change lives. Sometimes they're the people we least expect, in the places we least expect to find them. The paper heart that started it all may have fallen apart years ago, but the lesson it represents lives on. In the classrooms where Emma teaches, in the conferences where Michael speaks, in the families who learn to see autism not as a tragedy, but as a different way of experiencing the world. That lesson is simple but profound. Sometimes, all it takes to change a life is seeing someone truly, understanding them deeply, and responding to their needs with creativity and compassion. Sometimes, the most powerful intervention is simply recognizing that the person in front of you is worthy of understanding, regardless of how they communicate or behave. The waitress who understood gave us more than just a solution to a moment of crisis. She gave us a new way of seeing ourselves, a new way of navigating the world, a new way of building connections with others. She showed us that our differences weren't barriers to overcome, but bridges to deeper understanding. And in doing so, she reminded us that the world is full of possibilities for connection, understanding, and growth, if we're willing to look beyond the surface to see the person underneath. Today, when I encounter other families struggling with similar challenges, I try to be the person Emma was for us that night. I try to see beyond the behavior to the need, to respond with understanding rather than judgment, to offer support in whatever form seems most helpful. Because I learned that night at the wedding reception that sometimes the most profound acts of love come not from fixing or changing someone, but from seeing them exactly as they are and responding with acceptance and creativity. Sometimes it's as simple as humming a gentle rhythm and folding a paper heart. Sometimes that's everything. The story continues to unfold as all the best stories do. Emma now runs a nonprofit organization that provides support and resources for families affected by autism. Michael is considering a career in technology, where his unique way of processing information could be a significant asset. And I have learned to see our journey not as a series of challenges to overcome, but as a path toward deeper understanding and connection. The wedding reception that once felt like a disaster has become the foundation for a life filled with purpose, advocacy, and meaningful relationships. The waitress who understood became a lifelong friend and mentor. The paper heart that provided comfort in a moment of crisis became a symbol of hope and possibility. And the child who once struggled to navigate an overwhelming world has become a confident advocate for understanding and acceptance, helping others see that different doesn't mean less, that challenge doesn't mean limitation, that every person deserves to be seen and understood and valued for exactly who they are. This is the power of understanding. This is the gift of seeing beyond surface behavior to underlying humanity. This is what happens when we choose compassion over judgment, patience over frustration, love over fear. This is the story of how a moment of crisis became a lifetime of possibility, thanks to a waitress who understood that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply see someone truly and respond with kindness. The paper heart may have fallen apart, but the love it represented continues to grow and spread, touching lives in ways we never could have imagined. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful part of this story, that acts of understanding and compassion don't end when the moment passes, but continue to ripple outward, creating waves of positive change that can last a lifetime. In the end, that's what the waitress who understood gave us, not just a solution to a difficult moment, but a new way of being in the world. A way that sees possibility in every person, that responds to need with creativity and compassion, that builds bridges of understanding across the differences that too often divide us. And that, truly, is everything.